It was one of those ordinary Saturdays that quietly carried the weight of everything I loved. The kind of morning where the kids were still in their pajamas well past breakfast, their laughter echoing off the walls while sunlight poured through the kitchen window in warm, golden streaks. I was humming to myself, flipping pancakes that were slightly too brown on one side, when the doorbell rang, followed by the unmistakable sound of my sister's voice calling out before I even had a chance to reach the door. She never did believe in knocking, or boundaries, or discretion for that matter. I should have known something was coming. There's always a kind of static in the air before a storm, a tightness that settles somewhere in your chest just moments before your life takes a turn you can't undo. And yet, nothing prepared me for what she would say just 15 minutes later, sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, a mug of coffee in one hand and chaos resting carelessly on her tongue. My name is Rachel. I'm 43, a single mom by choice, and I've spent the last 11 years building a home for my 2 children, Ben and Lily. They're both adopted, though I've never used that word in front of them. Not because it's a secret I was ashamed of, but because I was waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the time when they'd be old enough to understand that love isn't diluted by biology, that family is something you build and nurture, not something dictated by blood. I imagine sitting them down someday with photo albums and stories, walking them gently into the truth of how they came to be mine. But that moment wasn't supposed to be today. And it most certainly wasn't supposed to come from my sister. You know, Rachel never actually gave birth to either of you, my sister blurted out between sips of her coffee, her tone so casual it could have been mistaken for trivia. She adopted you both. Isn't that wild? The words hit the room like a dropped glass vase, something sacred shattering into 1,000 pieces before I could reach out to stop it. Time didn't slow the way I'd always imagined it might in moments of crisis. It didn't even pause. It just kept going, cruelly uninterrupted, as my children looked at me with matching expressions of confusion and dawning horror. Lily blinked first, her brows pulling together as if trying to untangle a riddle she hadn't asked for. "What does she mean, Mom?" she asked, her voice a shaky whisper. Ben, older by 2 years and always quicker to react, stared at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before: distance. "Is that true?" he asked, and there was an edge to his voice that made my heart crumple. "We're adopted?" I couldn't breathe for a second. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to wrap this moment in all the context and care I'd planned to give it, but the words were stuck behind the thick wall of panic and disbelief. My sister, Ellen, kept talking, oblivious, or maybe indifferent, to the weight of what she'd done. "It's not a bad thing," she continued, waving her hand as if this were a conversation about where I bought the living room rug. "I mean, plenty of people adopt. It's practically trendy now." I stood up then, fast enough that my coffee spilled onto the floor, a dark stain spreading across the cream-colored rug we'd picked out together last year. The room was silent except for the quiet sound of the television in the background and the rapid flutter of my heart. "Ellen," I said, and even I didn't recognize the voice that came out of me. It was all gravel and heat. "Can I talk to you in the kitchen?" "Now." She shrugged, oblivious or pretending to be. "What?" "I thought they knew. You never said it was some big secret." In the kitchen, I shut the door and leaned against it, as if somehow that would keep the wreckage from spilling in further. "What the hell were you thinking?" I hissed. "Why would you say that in front of them?" She looked genuinely baffled for a second, as if my rage was an overreaction to a parking ticket. "Rachel, come on. They're not babies. You were going to tell them eventually, right?" "I was just saving you the trouble." "Saving me?" I repeated, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter. "You blew up years of planning in one sentence. You didn't save me, you ripped something from them without warning. Do you even understand what you've done?" She rolled her eyes, the same condescending gesture she's been perfecting since we were teenagers. "You're being dramatic. They'll get over it. You always make everything so heavy." I wanted to scream, to throw something, to rewind the clock and shove her out the door before she could speak. But all I could do was stand there, chest heaving, while my mind flashed through all the moments I'd imagined telling Ben and Lily, quiet, meaningful, full of love and warmth, and compare them to the horror I'd just witnessed. By the time I stepped back into the living room, the damage was done. Lily was curled up in the corner of the couch, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes red and wide. Ben stood near the bookshelf, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He didn't even look at me as I walked in. "I wanted to be the one to tell you," I said softly, kneeling beside Lily, my voice catching as I looked up at Ben. "Not because it was a secret, but because it matters. Because you matter. And I wanted you to hear it in the right way, with the full truth and all the love behind it." Ben didn't respond. Lily's lip quivered, but she leaned slightly toward me, enough for me to reach out and hold her hand. "Who are they?" Ben asked, his voice cold. "Our real parents." That word, real, pierced me deeper than anything Ellen could have said. I took a breath, willing myself not to cry. "I am your real parent," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But if you mean your biological parents, I'll tell you everything I know." "I promise." Silence again. The kind that drapes over a room and suffocates everything soft. I sat there, rooted in place, unsure of how to fix what had been broken in an instant. I knew this wasn't the end of the story, not for us, and certainly not for me. But I also knew something had shifted, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. That moment was meant to be sacred, intimate, and honest. Instead, it was shattered by someone who has always treated my life like a story she had the right to rewrite. And now I was left to pick up the pieces, not just of my children's trust, but of the quiet world I had worked so hard to build. That night, the house felt like it had been hollowed out from the inside, as if someone had quietly stolen the warmth and familiarity we once clung to without asking permission or offering warning. Even though the walls were still lined with family photos and the scent of lavender from the diffuser still lingered in the air, something essential had gone missing. Some invisible thread that used to bind us together now felt frayed and uncertain. I lay awake long after midnight, the silence of the house pressing heavily on my chest, my mind looping through every glance, every question, every word I should have said differently and didn't. Ben had locked himself in his room as soon as Ellen left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle a picture frame that still hung crooked. I'd knocked once, not expecting an answer, and wasn't surprised when none came. His silence wasn't new, but the distance in it was. This wasn't sulking over homework or frustration about a soccer game. This was different. There was a kind of wounded pride behind it, the kind that comes from realizing you've built your entire understanding of yourself on one version of reality, only to learn that parts of it were never quite true. Lily, on the other hand, didn't know what to do with her sadness. She kept trailing behind me, clutching the frayed corner of the blanket she's had since she was 3, her eyes round with unspoken questions. Every time I tried to hold her, she'd resist for a second, almost instinctively, as if unsure whether I was still the same person who tucked her in each night, or someone entirely different now that she knew the truth. "Mama," she whispered when I finally coaxed her into bed, "if you didn't grow me in your tummy, how do I know you really wanted me?" I don't think I've ever felt so fragile and so determined all at once. Her question reached into the very center of everything I'd feared about this moment, everything I'd spent years trying to shield them from by waiting for the perfect time. I stroked her hair slowly, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart felt like it was splintering in slow motion. "Oh, sweetheart," I said gently, "you weren't just wanted, you were chosen. I searched the whole world for you. I crossed every mile, signed every paper, waded through every delay because I knew, deep down, that you were meant to be mine." Her little fingers tightened around mine, but she didn't say anything back. She simply stared at the ceiling, her expression too serious for an 8-year-old, her breath slowing into sleep far later than usual. Even in slumber, her brow stayed slightly furrowed, as if her dreams had inherited the confusion her waking mind couldn't quite untangle. In the days that followed, I tried everything I could think of to recenter our lives: family dinners, movie nights, long walks to the park, even silly inside jokes I usually saved for car rides to school. But the air between us stayed thick and uncertain. They were still themselves, but not quite. Their trust in me hadn't vanished, but it had been knocked off its foundation, and now everything seemed to wobble under the weight of questions they didn't know how to ask yet. Ben was the one who pulled away the hardest. Always more reserved than Lily, he had a way of internalizing pain so deeply that sometimes even I forgot it was there. Now, he barely made eye contact, speaking only when necessary, his answers clipped and disinterested. When I asked if he wanted to talk, he shrugged. When I told him I loved him, he nodded but didn't say it back. When I asked if he was okay, he said he was fine, and I could tell he didn't mean a single word of it. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard, sitting under the old magnolia tree with an unopened book in his lap, his eyes fixed on nothing. I sat beside him quietly, not pushing, just sharing the space. "You know," he said eventually, his voice low, "I always thought I looked like you. Everyone says we have the same eyes." My heart clenched at the pain underneath those words. I reached for his hand, relieved when he didn't pull away. "You do look like me," I said softly. "Maybe not in the ways people expect, but in the ones that matter. You've got my stubborn streak, my love for old music, my way of asking too many questions when your mind gets curious. And those eyes? Maybe they're not from my genes, but they've been looking at me since the day I became your mom, and they're the most familiar thing in the world to me." He didn't reply, but he leaned his shoulder slightly against mine, and I took that as a victory, small, yes, but something to build on. Meanwhile, the tension between the kids themselves began to fester in quiet, complicated ways. Lily, needing comfort, kept reaching for Ben the way she always had, sitting close to him on the couch, asking to play board games, leaving silly notes on his bedroom door. But Ben, caught in his own storm, began to push her away, brushing off her affection with a sigh or a distracted glance. One evening, after he ignored her for the third time that day, she turned to me, tears welling up in her eyes. "Why doesn't he love me anymore?" she whispered. "Is it because we're not really brother and sister?" That question pierced me in places I didn't know were still raw. I gathered her into my arms and held her tightly, rocking her gently as if she were still a toddler waking from a bad dream. "No, baby," I whispered into her hair. "That's not what this is. You're a sister. You always have been, and you always will be. Sometimes, when people get hurt, they build walls for a while. But that doesn't mean they stop loving you. It just means they're figuring out how to heal." And in that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that healing was exactly what we had to do now, not just as individuals, but together. Because family isn't just about who you come from. It's about who stays, who shows up, and who fights to hold each other through the hard parts. We were bruised. We were confused. But we were still a family. And I wasn't about to let a careless word from someone who didn't understand the weight of love be the thing that defined our story. It took me 3 full days to calm the fire in my chest enough to speak without screaming, and even then, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to control myself when I saw her again. Every time I tried to sit with my children, to offer reassurance or just hold space for their confusion, I heard my sister's voice in the back of my mind, flippant, thoughtless, cruel. That single sentence she tossed into the room like it meant nothing had become a wrecking ball, smashing through the quiet safety I had spent over a decade building for my children. And the worst part wasn't just what she said, it was that she didn't even flinch when she said it. She hadn't called since that morning. Not to apologize. Not to explain. Not even to pretend it hadn't happened. It was typical Ellen, really, waltzing in like a whirlwind, dropping devastation at my feet, and then retreating into the fortress of her own self-righteousness as if she had never done anything wrong. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't willing to let it go. So, on a damp Thursday afternoon, I stood in front of her house, palms sweating despite the drizzle, rehearsing the words I knew I had to say, words that had been echoing inside me ever since she shattered my children's world with that single, careless remark. I didn't knock out of politeness. I knocked out of necessity, each strike of my knuckles against her door an act of restraint. I wasn't sure I could keep up for much longer. She opened the door in her usual breezy fashion, still holding a half glass of wine, barefoot, dressed like she had nowhere important to be. Her smile faltered the moment she saw my face, but she didn't move aside to let me in. Maybe she thought if she kept me on the porch, I'd stay civil. Maybe she didn't realize just how far past civil I already was. "Well, this is a surprise," she said lightly, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe as if we were two sisters catching up after brunch and not two women standing on opposite sides of a chasm she had created. "Come to yell at me, or are we skipping right to the part where you forgive me?" My voice came out low, steady, more dangerous than any shouting could ever be. "I came to tell you exactly what you've done. And to make sure you understand that we are not okay, Ellen. We're not even close." She rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine, the movement so casually dismissive that I felt the breath leave my body for a second. "Rachel, you're overreacting," she said with a sigh. "They were going to find out eventually. What's the big deal?" I took one step forward, and though she didn't move, I saw her fingers tighten slightly around the glass. "The big deal," I said carefully, "is that I had a plan. I had a time, a setting, a conversation full of care and context and love. You bulldozed into something sacred and turned it into gossip. You took their story, my children's story, and treated it like a punchline. They're just kids," she scoffed. "They'll bounce back. You coddle them too much anyway." My heart thudded hard against my ribs, and I had to pause, just for a second, to keep from saying something I'd regret. But what came next felt more important than my anger. It felt like a line in the sand. "No," I said, my voice tight with controlled fury. "They are not just kids. They are my children. They are my family. And whether you can see it or not, what you did hurt them in ways you can't even imagine." Ellen rolled her eyes again, slower this time, like she was genuinely bored with the conversation. "Oh, please," she muttered. "Don't start acting like they're really yours. They're not your flesh and blood, Rachel. You didn't give birth to them. You adopted them. That's different. Everyone knows it." For a split second, the world blurred around me. Her words hung in the air, venom wrapped in silk, and I stared at her as if I were seeing her for the very first time, not as the girl I'd grown up with, not as the woman who once braided my hair before high school dances, but as someone I couldn't recognize anymore. "That," I said slowly, each word deliberate and weighted, "is the most vile, ignorant, heartless thing I've ever heard come out of your mouth." She shrugged, as if it was simply a matter of opinion. "I'm just saying what people think and are too polite to say." "No," I snapped, unable to hold back the rage any longer. "You're saying what cruel people say when they want to feel superior. You're saying what cowards say when they don't understand love that looks different from theirs. And let me tell you something, Ellen, being a mother has nothing to do with DNA. It has everything to do with who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love without condition, over and over again, even when it's hard." She scoffed, crossing her arms now, her wine forgotten. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." "No," I said, stepping back, suddenly exhausted. "I'm finally seeing you for who you really are. And I don't want that kind of thinking anywhere near my children. If you can't see them as fully mine, if you can't accept that they are as real to me as if they had come from my body, then you don't deserve to be part of their lives." "Are you serious?" she snapped, the first sign of real emotion flashing across her face. "You're cutting me out over one comment?" "No," I said quietly, "I'm cutting you out because you don't think what you said was wrong. I'm cutting you out because I will not let anyone, even family, make my children feel like they are less than. They've already lost enough, Ellen. They don't need to lose their sense of belonging, too." I turned then, not waiting for her reply, because there was nothing left to say. The rain had started falling harder, soaking through my sweater, but I didn't care. I walked away from her house with each step feeling heavier and clearer than the last, the weight of the confrontation finally making room for something else, something fiercer than grief or rage. I was drawing the line. For them. For me. For the family I had built with my own two hands and all the love I had to give. Because love, real love is chosen. And from this moment forward, I was choosing to protect that love with everything I had. There are moments in life that sneak up on you, not with drama or fireworks, but with a kind of quiet power that changes everything without asking permission. For me, that moment came on a sleepy Sunday morning, just when I thought the dust from the fallout might finally be starting to settle. The kids were still sleeping, their doors closed, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea, trying to make sense of everything that had unraveled in the span of one careless comment and the silence that had followed it. I hadn't heard from Ellen since I walked away from her porch in the rain, and honestly, I hadn't expected to. She'd always been the type to disappear when things got real, never staying long enough to apologize, never sitting in the discomfort she caused. She didn't believe in repair. She believed in pretending nothing ever happened. I, on the other hand, was living in the wreckage of what she had done, piecing together my children's shaken sense of identity and holding the fragile pieces of trust between us in my hands like glass I was afraid to drop. So when my father called that morning and asked if he could stop by, my stomach sank before I even answered. My dad is many things: gentle, steady, a man of few, but carefully chosen words. But confrontation has never been his strong suit, especially when it came to his daughters. He was always the quiet presence in the background, the steady hands fixing leaky faucets and quietly washing dishes after family dinners. Ellen was more like our mother, sharp, vocal, impossible to ignore. And for most of my life, I'd watched Dad quietly step aside to avoid becoming collateral in her emotional storms. But something was different in his voice that morning. There was a kind of steel in it I hadn't heard before, a quiet resolve that didn't leave room for me to say no. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said simply. "I need to talk to both of you." When he arrived, I wasn't surprised to see that he'd already called Ellen, who pulled up in her sleek SUV 10 minutes after he did, still looking like she hadn't lost a wink of sleep. She walked in without knocking, of course, wearing a trench coat like she was headed to brunch, not a reckoning. "Dad," she said brightly, breezing past him into the living room, "I hope this isn't about the other day." Rachel's obviously blown things way out of proportion. I was about to respond, my heart already pounding in anticipation of another fight, when my father did something I'd never seen him do before. He stepped between us, his hand raised slightly like a barrier, and turned to Ellen with a look that silenced her mid-sentence. "This," he said slowly, the firmness in his voice unmistakable, "was not your story to tell." Ellen's smile faltered, her mouth still open as if the words had caught her mid-breath. She blinked, confused. "Dad." "No," he said again, this time sharper. "You don't get to excuse this away. You don't get to call it a misunderstanding. You took something sacred from your sister. You took something delicate from your niece and nephew. And you treated it like gossip at a backyard barbecue." I don't think I breathed during that entire speech. I just stood there, stunned, watching this man, who had always been more comfortable with silence than confrontation, speak with a strength that filled the entire room. Ellen recovered quickly, folding her arms across her chest in defiance. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just thought they already knew. How was I supposed to?" "That's the point," Dad cut in, his voice low and firm. "You didn't ask. You didn't check. You didn't care. You made a choice to speak, and now you need to understand the damage you caused." For a long moment, no one moved. Ellen's expression wavered somewhere between disbelief and indignation, as if she couldn't believe she was being scolded like a child. But I could see something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of shame she was trying to bury beneath her pride. "I didn't know it was that serious," she muttered finally, looking away. "I thought you all were being dramatic, as usual." My father let out a breath, slow and measured, and then turned to me. His voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. "Rachel," he said, meeting my eyes, "you have done something beautiful with your family. What you've built, it's rooted in love, not biology. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to speak about it." I think something broke loose inside me then, a tightness I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for years. Not just from this latest betrayal, but from every moment Ellen had undermined my choices, every time she'd belittled the way I parented, every time she'd rolled her eyes when I described the joy of being their mother. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice cracking around the edges. I needed to hear that. He nodded once and then turned back to Ellen, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to agree with everything Rachel does, but you will respect it. And if you ever want a relationship with those children again, you're going to need to take responsibility for the harm you've done." Ellen didn't reply. She looked at me for the first time that morning, and in her eyes, I didn't see malice or understanding. I saw something smaller, something cornered. Maybe she wasn't used to being held accountable. Maybe she never expected Dad to take a stand. But whatever she saw in his face, it was enough to keep her quiet as she turned and walked out without another word. The door closed softly behind her, and I sat down on the couch, suddenly exhausted. My father came over and placed a hand on my shoulder, that familiar warmth grounding me in the present. "She doesn't get to define what family is," he said gently. "You do. You always have." And in that moment, something else became clear, not just about Ellen, but about me. For years, I had made excuses for her cruelty, calling it sarcasm or misunderstanding. I had tiptoed around her moods, tried to make peace when she stirred conflict, convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than standing firm. But not anymore. Now, I saw her influence for what it was, a shadow cast too long over the light I'd been trying to build. And now, finally, I was ready to stand in that light fully, knowing I didn't have to do it alone. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with funerals or flowers or casseroles left at the door. It comes in quiet, aching waves when you finally accept that someone you love will never be the person you need them to be. I had felt versions of it before, those small, stinging moments over the years when Ellen dismissed my choices, undermined my parenting, or rolled her eyes behind my back when I talked about adoption, about motherhood, about anything that didn't fit neatly into her view of what a life should look like. But I had always brushed it aside, the way you brush away cobwebs without really looking at them. "It's just her way," I'd tell myself. "She doesn't mean anything by it. She's blunt, that's all." I excused her, rationalized her, and minimized the damage she caused because doing so felt easier than acknowledging the deeper truth. If I admitted what she was, then I'd have to change how I saw her. And changing how you see someone you've loved your whole life is like trying to shift the foundation of your own home. It shakes everything. After that Sunday morning, after Dad's unexpected intervention and her quiet retreat, I had hoped, naively I see now, that maybe Ellen would reach out. Not for the sake of peace or appearances, but because some small part of her might have finally heard the truth in his voice, the weight behind his words. But the silence that followed was not the silence of reflection. It was the silence of someone who felt wronged by being called out. The silence of someone who still didn't understand the harm she had caused, or worse, didn't care. What I didn't expect, though I probably should have, was the email she sent a week later. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance. The subject line read, "Let's move forward." The message was short, but painfully familiar in tone, detached, superior, utterly lacking in any meaningful accountability. She said she was sorry I misunderstood her intentions, that family drama never helps the children, and that we should put this all behind us and return to normal for the sake of the kids. I read it 3 times before deleting it without a reply. Because here's what I realized in that moment. In a way I had never quite allowed myself to accept before, Ellen wasn't just having a bad day when she revealed my children's adoption. It wasn't just an impulsive mistake or a social blunder. It was a reflection of who she was at her core, someone who believed that being right was more important than being kind, someone who thought love was a hierarchy built on blood and biology. Someone who would never see my family as fully real unless it fit inside her narrow, outdated definition of what real was supposed to look like. That email made something painfully, permanently clear. Ellen had no intention of changing, because she didn't believe she needed to. It was like someone had finally turned on a light in a room I'd spent years fumbling through in the dark. All the things I'd brushed aside, excused, or forgiven suddenly looked sharper and more dangerous in the clarity of hindsight. The time she joked at a family dinner that Ben's tantrums were probably in his genes. The time she offered to buy Lily a DNA testing kit, just for fun. The way she always asked when I was going to have one of my own, as if the children who called me mom every day weren't real enough. I saw it all now. Every dig, every side comment, every joke that left me feeling smaller. So I sat down that night and had a conversation with myself I should have had a long time ago. I asked what mattered most to me. I asked what kind of energy I wanted around my children. And I asked whether clinging to a broken relationship with my sister, out of obligation, out of nostalgia, out of fear, was really worth the price of my peace. The answer came easily this time. No, it wasn't. 2 nights later, I sat down with Ben and Lily at the kitchen table. It wasn't a big, dramatic moment. It was quiet, intentional, full of gentleness. I told them that sometimes, even people in our family don't understand what makes a family strong. I told them that love is not something that should ever be conditional. And I told them that we would not be spending time with Aunt Ellen anymore, not because we were angry, but because we needed to protect the love we had in our home. Lily reached out first, placing her small hand over mine. "You're our real mom," she said softly, without hesitation. "You're the only one we want." Ben didn't say anything right away, but he nodded slowly, his expression serious, thoughtful. After a moment, he looked up and said, "She made me feel like I didn't belong. I don't want to be around anyone who thinks that." And in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. I didn't send Ellen a reply. I didn't owe her a perfectly worded closure. What I owed, what I chose, was something far more important. I chose to protect the home I had built. I chose to guard the emotional safety of 2 children who had already experienced more disruption than they ever should have. I chose to honor the truth of our bond, not just with words, but with action. Letting go of Ellen didn't mean I stopped caring about her. It meant I stopped sacrificing myself and my children for a relationship that had become more about managing harm than sharing love. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to draw the firmest boundary possible. Sometimes, the real work of family is not clinging to what once was, but choosing what you refuse to carry forward. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen easily. Healing, I've learned, doesn't come with grand gestures or perfect words. It comes in small, steady moments when someone shows up again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And that's what I tried to do, day by day, one conversation, one hug, one late-night reassurance at a time. I showed up for my children, not because I had all the answers, but because I had something even more important, an unwavering commitment to remind them that they are loved, wanted, and rooted in something real. At first, the questions came slowly, and they came softly, like stones dropped gently into water, each one sending ripples that touched places we hadn't dared to explore before. Ben, always the thinker, would sometimes wander into the kitchen when I was packing lunches or folding laundry, and out of nowhere, he'd ask something like, "Did my birth parents love me before they let me go?" I never flinched, no matter how much his questions broke me open. I would stop what I was doing, kneel to his level, and give him what I had, the truth, wrapped in love, never sugar-coated but never cruel. "I believe they loved you in the way they could," I told him one afternoon, as we sat on the back porch watching the wind dance through the trees. "And I also believe they made a painful choice because they wanted something better for you. I may not know every detail, but I do know that every day since you became mine, I've thanked the universe that you found your way to me." Lily, younger and more emotionally open, processed things differently. She painted drawings of our family, sometimes with hearts around us, sometimes with jagged lines between the figures as if trying to capture the complexity of what she was feeling. One night, she brought me a picture she'd drawn of a tree with mismatched leaves, and at the base of the trunk she'd written, in her loopy second-grade handwriting, "Our family is not perfect, but it grows strong." I had to step into the hallway to cry before coming back to tell her how proud I was. With time, they began to relax into their own understanding of what it meant to be adopted. It wasn't a secret anymore, and it wasn't a source of shame. It was just a part of their story, a chapter that led to the love we shared now, a truth that didn't erase any part of who they were, but added to it instead. We started having what we called truth talks, little evening rituals where we'd sit together, sometimes on the couch, sometimes sprawled across the floor, and ask each other anything. No topic was off limits. We laughed more than we cried, but sometimes there were tears, and I welcomed everyone. Those moments became the scaffolding on which we built our new foundation, stronger and more honest than before. My dad became a more regular presence in our lives after everything happened, not in the grandparent who swoops in with gifts kind of way, but in the quiet, steady way that matters more. He would stop by just to help Ben with his science project or read Lily her favorite book for the third time in a row without complaint. The kids started calling him Pop again, a name they'd used when they were little but had stopped somewhere along the way. He wore that name like a badge of honor, and I could see in his eyes how much it meant to him that we were letting him in again. One Saturday morning, we were all at the farmer's market, hands full of fresh bread and strawberries, when Ben looked up at my father and said, "Pop, do you think families have to match to be real?" My father didn't hesitate. He bent down so they were eye to eye and said, "Real families are the ones who choose to love each other every single day. That's what makes them real, not matching, not DNA, but love." And just like that, something shifted again. I saw the corners of Ben's mouth twitch into a smile, the kind that meant he believed what he'd heard, not just with his mind, but with his heart. That afternoon, as we sat on the porch eating fresh bread and jam, Lily leaned against my side and whispered, "I like our family just how it is." I wrapped an arm around her and kissed the top of her head, not needing to say anything more. The moment spoke for itself. I used to think I had to protect them from every possible hurt, that if I planned carefully and loved hard enough, I could shield them from the cracks in the world. But now I understand that love doesn't mean preventing the hurt, it means being the safe place they can return to when the hurt comes. We still don't talk to Ellen, and I've made peace with that. Some relationships cannot be salvaged without sacrifice that costs too much. And while I mourn what could have been, I no longer mourn what isn't. In letting go of that toxic bond, I made room for something richer, something more whole, a family that is chosen every day by the way we show up for one another, a love that does not demand blood to be real, and a home that offers safety, not just physically, but emotionally. There will always be moments of doubt, of sadness, of questions I can't answer completely. But there will also always be bedtime hugs, inside jokes, shared glances that speak volumes, and a depth of love that doesn't require explanation to feel real. In the end, that's what family has become for us, not a structure handed to us by birth, but a garden we've tended with intention, watered with honesty, and nourished with patience. It may not look like everyone else's, and it may not be understood by everyone we know, but it is ours. And in its imperfection, it has become something profoundly beautiful.